Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Navigating FDA Regulations for Dietary Supplements. This webinar will be hosted by Hollis Cloninger and Garrett Zielinski with me today. Hollis is currently serving as Director of Quality and Compliance at Eurofins Food Chemistry Testing in Madison, Wisconsin. Is a seasoned professional with extensive experience in GLP, GMP, FSMA, and ISO QA functions. So with a background in clinical laboratory science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Hollis has consistently demonstrated leadership in roles such as Director of GLP QA at Covance Food Solutions and Director of Regulatory Affairs at Clean Test Product Corporation. So in those roles, overseeing different diverse teams and maintaining constructive relationships with external regulatory bodies. Her comprehensive experience in driving initiatives for quality maximization, efficiency, regulatory compliance has made her an invaluable asset in the field, reflecting her dedication to quality assurance and regulatory excellence. Garrett Zielinski, currently the Senior Client Service Manager at Eurofins Food Chemistry Testing, also in Madison, brings over 20 years of experience and expertise in program development, analytical services management, and organic chemistry. So with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Garrett has showcased his leadership skills through various roles, including senior technical leader and team leader analytical chemist, making significant contributions to the field of biochemistry and analytical services. So I am Scott Bashakian, not Amy Knock. I'm filling in for Amy this morning, and I'll be moderating this webinar. So before we begin, I'm going to let you know a little bit about how the webinar will run. The webinar is being recorded. The slides and recording from today will be available within 3 business days after the webinar. During the webinar, you can submit questions that you have. You do so using the little webinar sidebar menu. All you do is drill down on the questions tab, type in your questions, and then hit the enter key on your keyboard. So any questions raised during the webinar will be addressed immediately after we conclude today. Okay, with that, Hollis, I'm going to pass the webinar over to you to begin the conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Scott. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our presentation today regarding FDA regulations for dietary supplements. Today's presentation will cover a regulatory overview. Then we will be discussing compliance responsibility within the dietary supplement regs. We will go on then to some 483 trends that we see from the FDA. And then finally, some testing and laboratory considerations for those specifications. So to start our regulatory overview, in 1994, Congress passed the Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act, which we in the industry refer to as the SHAE. And in June 2007, FDA issued the final rule, 21 CFR Part 111. That law is the fundamental regulation that governs dietary supplements in the United States. The providers, the guidance provides responsibilities for the brand owners, the manufacturers, packagers, the labelers, and the holders of dietary supplements. This regulation is all-encompassing for everyone within the supply chain. Subparts A through P cover aspects from the beginning of the manufacturing process all the way through product distribution. And in some cases, a single company can perform all of these activities, and in others, a company may only have one piece of this supply chain. But the final rule is broken down into the subparts encompassing the complete life cycle, if you will, of the entire dietary supplement. The goal, obviously, of this regulation is to ensure that dietary supplements are safe and that they are accurately labeled for consumers. So the subparts are as follows, A through P. And just giving you a little guidance and overview of where you can find information within these subparts. Part A is the general provisions. In this section, you can find definitions, as well as the scope of what the dietary supplement regs cover. In section B, in our personnel section, the regulation discusses cross-contamination, and it's focusing on contamination from people to the product. So we talk about in here where our requirements for hairnets and gloves come, and why we don't eat food in the same areas that we're manufacturing products. And we talk about if our employees are sick, that we don't want them working with our dietary supplements. So that's where you can find that information related to personnel. In section C, we can see that the FDA is telling us what our physical facility needs to look like, what the requirements are, how it needs to be built and maintained. It refers to, you can find things like pest control requirements in this section. In section D, in equipment and utensils, this is where we find cleaning and sanitization requirements. We can also find calibration requirements within this section for the equipment that we're going to be using to manufacture or package our dietary supplements. In section E, production and process control systems, this is the section that we are going to focus on as in this webinar, not exclusively, but the majority. This section is very important. It is a large section within the regulation. It is the section that controls all stages of the manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and holding of the dietary supplements. It is the section that tells us that we're going to use master manufacturing records to document. It tells us that we are going to establish specifications. We're going to establish specifications for our components. Those components need to have a specification for identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contamination. It also talks about in-process specifications, that when we are fabricating and manufacturing our dietary supplement, whether that be, a grinding step or an extraction step or a blending step, we need to put those specifications in place. Again, identity, strength, purity, composition, and contamination. We need to address all of those things in our in-process specs. Those can also, in processes, can also be important when you're adding a particular component to the process that is maybe not necessarily an ingredient. If you've got a release agent or something along that regards, is making sure to control those things in your in-process controls. This section also goes into label specifications, packaging specifications. FDA tells us, right, the containers should not be reactive or absorptive. The specifications for packaging are really important. The packaging of your dietary supplement can have a significant impact on the stability of your product. So we want to make sure we get those packaging specifications correct. Finished product also. FDA tells us again that we need to identify the dietary supplement, again, purity, strength, composition, contamination. We must qualify our suppliers of all the components and the packaging. This section talks about how we need to reconfirm the certificate of analysis and make sure the suppliers are providing what we expect them to provide for the components. In just a particular example, if we have, if we receive a supplier C of A for any component, we need to make sure we match that back to our specifications, and ensure that the supplier is giving us what we expect. We need to know our supply chain. FDA is pretty clear in this section about all of this verification that needs to happen in establishing specs, that we need to understand our components. We need to make sure we're mitigating risk against those components. Especially in our dietary supplement environment, we could have suppliers that are providing components from multiple plants, multiple manufacturing sites, multiple countries. And can you identify that information when the C of A comes from that supplier? Sometimes there's the country of origin is listed, can be identified by lot numbers or other unique identifiers. But all of those things are covered in this really big section, E, that is establishing our process control. In section F, we go through the requirements of what our quality control personnel do. This is an interesting section in that it tells us FDA is basically dictating to us a job description. They are telling us what quality is supposed to do and giving review and approval process to that group. In section G, we are talking about inspecting all of the incoming components, packaging, labels, that we're going to put things in quarantine. We're going to assign them unique identifiers, that we're going to basically follow a process of positive release. In section H, with the master manufacturing records, details how we do, that we use lot numbers or batch numbers, and that we conduct and capture yield calculations for our manufacturing process. In subpart I, we talk about the batch production record itself. Basically, in this section, FDA is telling us that we better write everything down or it didn't happen. So we capture every aspect of the manufacturing production process. In subpart J, we are talking about the laboratory specifically. FDA is telling us we need to use scientifically valid methods, which obviously need to be accurate, precise, and specific. We need to have data to demonstrate that. In subpart K, we talk about cleaning and temperature controls, just the overall cleanliness and control of environments, if you will. In section L, we are talking about packaging and labeling process controls with reconciliation, verification of those labels. This section has evolved recently with capabilities in scanning technology and types of equipment where we can verify every label 100%. Section M for holding and distribution. This is where we talk about our warehouse or our distribution setups for looking at temperature and humidity and light controls and prevention so that our finished product is not affected by any external factors, mix-up or contamination. We don't want to at the end of the process have an issue with deterioration or putting the wrong label on something. Distribution controls and records as well, where the product went and when. And then finally, sections N, O, and P are pretty straightforward. We need a process for returned dietary supplements, product complaints, and then just records and record keeping in general. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that there are associated regulations that go along with Part 111, including FSMA and 21 CFR Part 11 itself for electronic records. Those are also regulations that impact our dietary supplement manufacturing process and control. So they're important to consider in your compliance regulations as well. So who's responsible? So all of that stuff FDA told us to do. Now, where does this responsibility go? How do we make sure we manage this? So FDA says somebody is responsible. So we'll talk about the manufacturers first. The manufacturers obviously have a heavy lift in this process. They have to establish their quality control systems like we talked about. They have to make sure that they have qualified employees, that they go through the process of training, that they don't hire anyone who is disbarred, and all of that goes along with making sure our employees are trained in our dietary supplement regulations. The manufacturers have to maintain the facilities and the equipment according to the regulations that we just talked about, right? Lots of requirements around calibrations and maintenance of water and things like that from our facility standpoint. Implementing the production and process controls. Again, this is what we're going to focus on, these production and process controls, developing these specifications that FDA is telling us are so important. The manufacturer can be the brand owner. Doesn't have to be, right? Our dietary supplement supply chains can be very complex. Dietary supplements are also a highly variable manufacturing process, just as an industry as a whole. Dietary supplements are kind of can cover a wide variety of, dosage forms to components themselves. Then we get into the packagers and labelers. Obviously, this is a critical step for ensuring that the dietary supplements are safe. What we want to try to mitigate against is manufacturing the product properly and then having an issue with our packaging materials. So the inspections of the packaging materials are very important. Again, we don't want to work so hard to make a dietary supplement that's not contaminated and then we stick it in a dirty bottle. We need to try to mitigate against those things with some specifications. Again, performing appropriate testing for your bottles and caps. We may have lids with safety seals inside, right? Are they working? Are they not working? Making sure that those container closure systems are doing what they are intended to do, part of your testing program. And then finally, labeling. It is a responsibility of the labeler to ensure that the labels actually reflect what is in the bottle or in the product. Labeling can be a complicated part of dietary supplement manufacturing, depending on who controls the label and how the communication goes between, manufacturer or brand owner to make sure those labels stay accurate. And finally, holders, the last stage of our manufacturing process where we are going to distribute. This is where we hold for final release of the supplement. Holders can be manufacturers or brand owners or multiple different possibilities here. But this is where we need to make sure we have maintained the documentation as our final check, that we've got all the documentation and records that we need from all the steps: manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and distribution. Brand owners. Brand owners are the ones who are ultimately responsible for all the activities of the manufacturing and distribution process. If your company is the one that is responsible for putting it into commerce, into the U.S. for consumers, you're ultimately responsible for those activities therein, all of them. And I think what we wanted to highlight here, this is a warning letter where FDA has clearly said, although your firm may contract out certain parts of the dietary supplement manufacturing operations, which could be the manufacturing of the capsule itself or gummy itself, the labeling of that, the packaging of it, any of those things, the laboratory testing. Just because you contract it out, it is your responsibility if any part of that process fails to comply with the dietary supplement regs. You cannot, FDA is very clear in these letters that you cannot outsource your responsibility to make sure that that dietary supplement is safe. And so now to continue on, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Garrett to talk a little bit more about these 483 trends that we are seeing.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, so we're talking about some 483 trends. All right, so looking back past 15 years or so, the most 483s have actually come from that subpart E, requirement to establish production and process control system. And then the top 5 from subpart E have been consistent as well. Specification, this refers to finished product specs. Components, so component refers to anything, basically anything that goes into the supplement. So it could be a dietary ingredient, or it could be some type of filler, binder, something like that. For the here specifically, we're looking at the dietary ingredient and the verifying identity. I'll go a little bit more into specifications and the verify identity part a little bit later. So the other 3 kind of big hitters, specifications met for finished products. So Hal's kind of alluded to it before, but you need specs for your finished product, but then you also need to make sure that they're actually verified in some fashion. Specifications again for component identity. So that refers to not dietary ingredient, but any component that could be in there. And then the other piece is specs related to component purity, strength, composition. So that needs to be documented as well for dietary ingredients and any components. Even though when we think about purity, strength, composition, that's mainly we refer to the dietary ingredient. That's where it gets called out the most. And I'll show some data on the next few slides. I took that data from Marion Bordley's website. She looks at FDA's data and kind of puts it into a easy to follow format. She's a great resource for trends and can help with other pieces too as far as FDA compliance. So I definitely check out her website if you have time. Here's a graph of some of the 483 citations from subpart E from the past few years. I believe 2023 may be out because I think the FDA fiscal year or how they do it might end actually before the end of the year. But this is for the past 5 years, which all the data is included. So again, we have the top 5 that I had included on the previous slide. So you can see here, if you look at the red bar, that's the component, the verified identity of the dietary ingredient. So that was kind of a bigger piece. 2018, that has kind of went down a little bit. So hopefully that means industry in general is performing that function of verifying the identity of their dietary ingredients, and that needs to be done on basically every batch of finished product you use. You have to verify the identity before you actually use it. That's one piece that some companies, they might verify it when they do their qualification of a certain ingredient, but then not really worry about it after that. But it needs to be done for every single batch of finished product. But the biggest hitters here, again, are specifications for finished products. Again, that identity, purity, strength, composition, by far are the biggest biggest hitters. Something that everybody needs to really be focused on, because FDA, when they come in to do an audit, this is something they're absolutely going to look for. They're going to make sure you have specifications, and you have to have those documented in your own type of quality control systems. It's I don't know if it's acceptable, but it's definitely not ideal. A ingredient C of A and say, these are my specs. What you're getting from another company, those could be, but you need to do that evaluation and risk assessment to ensure that the specifications you're setting are appropriate for your manufacturing process and your finished product. So again, just another example of an actual warning letter. So not necessarily a 483. Warning letters are kind of that additional step FDA takes if you're potentially not doing the things that you should after you get a 483. So FDA calls out this as a warning letter. Warning letters are all on the public domain. I get I think weekly emails with FDA warning letters where it'll shoot me a link to their website, and I can search up any warning letters that have been updated there. So it's all in the public, and probably from a business perspective, it's not great to be on there. So to try to be ahead of things is definitely preferred. But they do call out fail to provide specs that ensure identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contamination of your dietary supplements. So you really need to have in your specification, identity covered, purity covered, strength covered, composition, and then contaminants. Ideally, I've seen specifications that have these all in different sections. I think that's probably cleanest. You don't necessarily need to do that as long as in your specs, each of these areas is covered. Another example of a company that had, they had specifications for a raw material, but they didn't include identity specs. So, that's having specs is better than not. But again, you need to cover all of those different pieces in your specs to comply with the law. So establishing specs, this can be this can be a challenging piece. For a new company, or if you're developing a new product. You have to look at your whole manufacturing process and determine your specifications based on that. So you don't only need specs for raw materials, but you also need specs for in process specs and finished product specs. So a lot of times we think of component specs, active ingredients, dietary ingredients, other components, and we think finished product specs. But we also need in process too, and those are going to relate to your manufacturing process and any stages where there might be non-homogeneous product, degradation. So if you're making a gummy, you're heating, you're whole time in a mold, all those things, those can impact your end finished product, purity, potency. Then you need to check those things in process to make sure you're manufacturing a consistent quality product every time. Again, back to those 5 points: identity, purity, strength, composition, limits of potential contaminants. You consider those at each of these steps. The component, raw material piece, and process and finished product. So there's really a lot that goes into specs, and it takes a lot of work to set these things up. Ideally, before you start sourcing raw materials, before you develop your manufacturing process, because it's hard once you start it to try to backtrack and develop specs that way. So I'll go through a few different examples of kind of specifications and ways that you can develop these and what it kind of looks like. For each of these, I've included some definitions for what it is. Like identity, I'll include a definition, and those definitions aren't in the regs themselves, but they're in the preamble to the regs. I think that's a good resource. It's pretty lengthy, a few hundred pages, but it provides a good resource of what FDA is thinking and maybe elaborates a little bit and provides some examples for how to interpret the regs. I think we all know the FDA regs are kind of vague in areas, and that can be challenging to figure out exactly what you need to do. So identity. Preamble says ingredients or dietary supplement is what it is intended to be. We'll throw an example here of powdered Asian ginseng extract. So this is just for the identity part. So we have test the actual spec, so what it has to meet to be acceptable, and also the method of analysis. So for this one, I pulled this one out because this shows you might need more than one test for a certain specification. So for identity of this, there's HPLC plus a chemical test plus an HPLC test, and all those together, in this situation, are what would be needed to verify the identity of this. For this one, we used USP methods because they're available. A lot of times, if there's USP methods available or like AOAC or some compendial methods, it's easier to kind of use those if your product or ingredient is applicable to that method, but you absolutely don't need to. You just need, I'll get into the scientifically valid piece in a little bit, but you just need to make sure that your method works for its intended use. So you don't need to run 3 USP methods, for example, if you have an in-house developed method that will do what you want it to do, assuming your internal method is scientifically valid and you have all that data to kind of back it up. Next piece is purity. So this is the portion or percentage of the supplement or ingredient that represents the intended product. Example here, ascorbic acid, so vitamin C. So a purity test would be the content of ascorbic acid. So specification, about 98% on a dry basis. Method, again, we use USP. So the purity piece, anything that isn't your intended product or ingredient is considered an impurity because it's not what it should. That doesn't necessarily mean those impurities are contaminants or harmful in any way. It's just saying that it's not what your intended product is supposed to be. And it's also good to, if you have purity specs or other specs, to ensure it's clear on your spec sheet, whether it's on dry basis or not. We've seen, some of these where it's not really specified, and that can cause issues, especially for, high purity ingredients or high purity products, or hydrophobic ingredients and products. Hydrophobic. Strength of a supplement refers to the quantitative amount per specific unit of measure. So basically, strength is what you'll see on the label. Another example, Asian ginseng capsule. We have the strength test, content of ginsenosides. We have our specification. We also have in parentheses, what that spec is based on. So it's the extract that was used in the finished product. Also includes the sum of the individual ginsenosides. So we have a method noted right there as well. So on your specs, for things like ginseng, other botanicals, ginsenosides for ginseng, and like curcuminoids and other things like that, it's also ideal to call out what are the individual components you're testing for. So instead of just saying content of ginsenosides and not putting out the individual analytes, that could kind of be, misleading to someone who's trying to verify that spec, or someone who's trying to understand what's all included in that spec. That's one thing that we've come across as well. And it's good for that, just to kind of be when you're doing these types of chemical methods. It's also ideal to call out, to be as kind of descriptive as possible with the method of analysis. If you have a certain internal method code that you use, including that on your spec sheet is good. If you're using a third-party lab, including their spec sheet or their method code, that's ideal as well. Composition is the amount or percentage of all the constituents contained in the supplement. So basically, all the things that you're putting into it, does it contain that? So for this one, it would be the active capsule itself, because that's part of the dietary ingredient. That's what's being ingested, and any other fillers or things like that. Ways to verify this, just weight verification by your batch record, making sure that's done correctly, accurately captured, potentially second person verified. Another big one is limits of contaminants. So the regulations call out limits of potential contaminants. So this is where it's not always clear cut on what your contaminants are. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to consider raw materials and finished products. So for powdered agent extracts, there's a bit that could be in there since it's a botanical natural product. If you look at pesticides, that's gonna that should probably be done. If not every batch, some type of statistical sampling of that to make sure it doesn't have pesticides. Heavy metals is a huge one. There was recently some stuff in the news about heavy metals in applesauce products. Solvents, if it's an extract. Microbial testing. So for the the general kind of indicators, so mold count, but then also for any specific microbes that are very harmful. To develop these specs, you really need to do like a risk assessment of your ingredients, your process, and then also look at your finished product. What would be needed there? Another thing to consider is, I think, adulterants for this space as well. So if you have a sports nutrition weight loss type product, looking at some potential contaminants there that might be added on purpose at some point to make it more kind of effective. And even if you control the manufacturing process, all your ingredients, even if it's not in there, having it on your spec and kind of showing to anybody who asks, whether you're selling somebody that you've tested for this and it doesn't contain it, that can just give a lot of confidence to potential retailers or other folks buying your product that really done your due diligence. Now I'll talk about a few of the testing and lab kind of considerations with ensuring specs are met. So for each spec, each line item essentially, you have to use an appropriate scientifically valid method for which testing or examination is required. So FDA calls out scientifically valid. They don't say validated. They don't say verified. They don't really dictate exactly what your method needs to do. They don't tell you need to do so many reps of accuracy for validation, all that stuff. They don't follow or reference AOEC guidelines for validation, or USP or ICH or any of that. They just say scientifically valid method. They do call out that the method has to be accurate, precise, and specific. or appropriate for intended use. So if you're developing a method, or your internal lab has a method, or you're subcontracting to a third-party lab, you need to make sure that the methods are scientifically valid, and that there's data to support that, which includes accuracy, precision, specificity, or in terms of it's appropriate for what it is. Then another piece of this, in your testing program, you have to have some type of corrective action plan for when your spec isn't met. So whether it's an OOS SOP, LIR SOP, so what are the steps that you do to figure out the root cause of your spec not being met? This could involve looking at all your ingredients, verifying that all those met specification, verifying that your ingredient specs are appropriate, looking at your manufacturing records, but then also working with your internal lab or contract lab, to make sure that the method was performed and the results are accurate. So not using a scientifically valid method, so FDA has called that out on warning letters. They basically said you have not demonstrated that the method used for this example, probiotic species, is scientifically valid. They might not say, and in this example, I don't believe they actually said what would be scientifically valid, but they're saying that it's not appropriate. Another one, which kind of digs a little deeper. So you have a method. FDA reviewed that method, and they determined that there was an improper reference material. They called out your standard reference material is inappropriate because it is a previous lot of product for which identity has not been confirmed. A previous lot is not acceptable to be used as a reference material unless it has been verified by appropriate methods. So you can't produce a lot of vitamin C, for example, and then have that be your reference standard. You can't compare that via FTIR versus a future lot and call that good. You need to make sure that your methods are accurate, precise, and specific with data to support all that. So some requirements for the actual laboratory. When testing is being performed, whether it's within your manufacturing facility or outsourced to a third-party lab, they need to follow their appropriate regulations as well. Hollis went through some of those earlier, but so regardless, the brand owner and manufacturer is responsible for their pieces of it. So the testing part is associated with the manufacturing. It's considered to be part of that process. So they all need to follow the appropriate regs. So one warning letter on this piece, FDA audited laboratory, and they observed that quality control operations did not include reviewing and proving results of required tests as required in the regulations. So they'll dig into the laboratory's kind of SOPs, quality systems as well. So they need to be responsible for their parts. So a few conclusions. So quality starts with developing those specifications, ensuring that they're appropriate through the entire manufacturing process. Again, ideally you're doing all this up front. Once you know the intended product is that you're supposed to, that you're trying to make it again. You want to get all your manufacturing SOPs, all your specs set up on the front end. So then you don't really have to worry about it after the fact, and then you can also source your materials based on your specifications that you've already developed. Incorporate specs for each identity, purity, strength, composition, and contaminants for each of those materials, for your raw materials and finished products, but also for in process. So it's definitely a lot there to kind of be proactive with and set up. And then last, use proper analytical methods. So ideally, in that front end, when you're setting up all your specs, you're considering the method piece as well. Trying to find, work with your internal lab, third party lab, find methods that are going to be applicable for your product, not waiting until you have your finished product or you have your ingredients sitting in your manufacturing floor waiting to use to try to find methods at that time. It can be kind of daunting knowing that you're not going to need them for 6 months, but if you can do that legwork up front, I think it'll definitely save a lot of headaches. And there's overall supplement industry, there's a lot of gray areas in the regs, and there's a lot to do and a lot to consider. So there are a lot of companies, consultants out there that can help with all these parts, or even just like little pieces of this to kind of help you get set up. And that is everything that we had for today.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Garrett. Thank you, Hollis. Great overview and expertise presentation today. So I just wanted to remind everyone, I did see a lot of questions come along in the chat, and we will be following up after this presentation, and we'll not be addressing them here, but we'll be sure to follow up and get all these questions answered here immediately after the webinar. I also want to remind everyone that a recording the webinar along with a copy of the slides will be available within 3 business days. So again, I just want to thank you, Hollis. Thank you, Garrett, one more time, and I guess thank you everybody else for attending. Let's go ahead and wrap it up here. So thanks again.